Today's video is designed to update you on the key issue of how polarised is the USA in 2015. So we'll be considering the different evidence, or different recent evidence, that the USA has become more polarised. First of all, I'd like to consider why is the USA generally considered to become more polarised in recent times, and what examples can you think of? Pause the video and consider that question. So why has the US become more polarised? Firstly, and most significantly, the more moderate wings of each party have withered away, in some cases over many years. So for example, the more recent Blue Dog Democrats have lost a lot of support, along with other conservative and more moderate Democrats, and the Rockefeller Republicans are generally considered to be a dying breed as Republicans move to the right. Now, this is because the parties have become more ideologically distinct. Rather than being broad-based umbrella organisations covering people with a wide range of views, the Republicans have become a lot more conservative, a lot more identified with the right, and Democrats have become a lot more liberal and a lot more identified with the left. And this all links in to an increase in partisanship, where one party votes against the other party no matter what its policies. And you can see this with the Affordable Care Act, where all Republicans voted against it in protest at this law. Now today, we're going to look at 5 different reasons why it has become more polarised in 2015. So first of all, the ideological divisions between the parties have widened. Secondly, the support from the middle of the electorate has shrunk as people have shifted to the right or the left. Similarly, the elected officials have shifted to the right and the left, making Congress more polarised. The parties have increasingly begun to hate each other, both in Congress and in the wider United States, and there are increasingly partisan views towards the presidency. And this update is largely based around a piece of research conducted by an organisation called Pew Research, which was published in June 2014 and gives interesting insights into the state of the electorate. So first of all, it suggests that the ideological divisions are widening between people in the US. Or, as we said it before, the Republican Party has moved to the right and the Democrats to the left. So Pew Research asked people 10 questions about a range of issues, including immigration, gun control, the size of government, etc. Then it qualifies the answers as either liberal or conservative. Now what's interesting, what's happened is that more of the electorate are now clearly uniformly liberal or uniformly conservative. Or in other words, in answering the 10 questions, they give answers which are always either more liberal or more conservative. In 2004, it was roughly 10% of Americans who were either completely defined as conservative or completely defined as liberal. Now it is more like 21%. So increasingly it's clear that people identify themselves either as liberals or conservatives in all that they do. Now Pew Research has also suggested that the middle has shrunk. Now in 1994 there were still significant overlaps between the parties. Now, what we mean by this is that if you take the typical Republican, there is still a significant amount of Democrats who are more conservative than the average or typical Republican. Similarly, if you took the average or typical Democrat, there is still a significant amount of Republicans who are more liberal than the average or typical Democrat. However, by 2014, it was very clear that there were very few Republicans who are more liberal than Democrats, and very few Democrats who are more liberal than Republicans, showing that in the middle of the divide, there are less moderates who tend to bridge both parties on some issues. So this lack of moderates has translated into Congress. Previously, these moderates would be used by the other side, or centrists as they're sometimes called, to vote with the other side in Congress on a range of issues to create some bipartisan support for different issues. Now, these moderates have now largely disappeared as the parties have become more distinct. For example, the Blue Dog Democrats have shrunk massively, and actually they didn't vote with the Republicans on the Affordable Care Act, but against them, as they eventually voted with the Democrats. So currently, if we look at overlaps between the Liberals and the Conservatives in the chambers of Congress, there are no senators who are Republican and more liberal than Conservative Democrats, or Democrats who are more conservative than the most liberal Republican. So there is none in the Senate. There is the odd maverick in the House, so a handful, 5 in total, who would be considered to be Republicans who are more liberal than the most conservative Democrat, or a Democrat more conservative than the most liberal Republican. But basically, the elected officials are clearly significantly polarised. Another factor is that the parties increasingly hate each other. And this might seem strange. Clearly the parties have never overly liked each other, but what seems to be happening is that there is an extra level of animosity between the two parties. Now, this is shown in the Pew research, because in 1994, 16% of Democrats had a very unfavourable view of the Republicans, and 17% of Republicans felt this way about the Democrats. Now, in 2014, this had jumped to 38% and 43% respectively, showing an extra level of animosity or extra support of animosity between the two parties. Perhaps more only, 27% of Democrats and 36% of Republicans believe that the opposing parties' policies will seriously damage the country. And in fact, the phrase they used was they were so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being, clearly showing a lack of trust and a certain amount of animosity between the two parties. Now, this animosity also extends to the president, where there are increasingly partisan views towards the presidency and the office of the president. So parties have always generally approved of their own presidents, with an average of roughly 80% over the last 60 years, with Jimmy Carter, perhaps unsurprisingly, being the least supported, with only 57% of his own party supporting him. However, approval from the opposing party has dropped significantly. On average, it's roughly 40% approval rating, with highs of 49% for Eisenhower and Kennedy. The lowest is for Obama, with only 14% approval rating. And you can see a general slide down the approval ratings as you go down the presidents of recent times. Now, this could be considered to be evidence for the huge partisan gap in the USA, and the fact that clearly the presidents are no longer a sign of unity between two separate parties. So, conclusions. The USA has actually been described as a nation of gaps by Professor John Kenneth White in 2005. Now, what we mean by that is that there is huge gaps in certain areas between how people vote. So, for example, there is a gender gap, that disproportionately women vote Democrat, men vote Republican. An education gap, where people with a lower education tend to vote Democrat, higher education tend to vote Republican. Gun ownership gap, abortion gap, race gap, sexual orientation gap, urban-rural gap, and a level of religiousness gap. So there's a whole range of issues where people vote differently according to their identification with different groups. Now, the biggest gap, however, is the partisan gap, with Republicans overwhelmingly voting Romney and Democrats Obama in 2012. Now, again, this might not be that surprising, but perhaps the level that this is happening is because it was not always this way. If you go back to 1972, 33% of Democrats voted for Nixon, and even as recently as 1996, 13% of Republicans voted Clinton. And this is the peculiarity of the American system, where the president is not necessarily completely identified with the party they come from and is seen as a figure which in some ways should transcend party politics. Obviously we know that this happens due to the rise and the use of split ticket voting, but clearly this is becoming less and less common, with in 2012 only 7% of Democrats voting Republican and 6% of Republicans voting Democrat, showing that there is a partisan gap. So in summary, the USA has become more partisan over recent years for many reasons, and it's clear this is becoming more defined in 2015, with the partisan gap getting worse, with most voters voting along party lines and a general polarisation in the system. So the reasons for this divide include widening ideology, less people in the middle, polarised officials, animosity between the parties, and partisan views towards the president. Lastly, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. First of all, which of these areas do you think is the most significant in showing and causing the polarisation in the USA? Secondly, do you think this divide is reversible, and how could it be reversed? And lastly, Clinton and Nixon are both strong presidents with broad support. Is the party divide cyclical? And what I mean by that, do you think this is something which happens over time and then changes on a cycle? This has been a Flip Your History video. More information and more videos are available on TES if you search Flip Your History, or for more information about Flip Learning and my Flip Learning journey, go to Twitter at Flip Your History or my blog flipyourhistory.wordpress.com. Thank you for listening.